What if I told you nothing in your life is actually listening to you? Not people, not circumstances, not even fate. Only one thing is responding every second of your existence: the way you talk to yourself when no one is watching. And the shocking truth is this: the moment you correct that inner voice, reality has no choice but to follow. Before we go deeper, pause for a moment and ask yourself, what have you been consistently telling yourself about your life? And more importantly, is it something you would want your future to obey? If this is resonating, stay with this message until the end, because what comes next will show you how to reprogram the voice that has been shaping your entire reality. Your inner dialogue is the continuous conversation you maintain with yourself, and it operates as the silent foundation of how you interpret every experience in life. It is not merely thought, but a running commentary that assigns meaning to everything you encounter. This inner speech becomes the lens through which external reality is filtered and understood. When you repeatedly speak to yourself in doubt, limitation, or fear, you begin to unconsciously train your perception to find evidence that confirms those states. The mind does not distinguish between imagination and instruction, so whatever you consistently affirm inwardly becomes the blueprint for how you respond outwardly. Over time, these repeated internal statements solidify into belief systems that guide behavior decisions and emotional reactions. As these beliefs deepen, they begin to shape the choices you make and the opportunities you notice or ignore. This is how inner dialogue slowly constructs the framework of your lived reality. What you consistently tell yourself becomes the identity you embody without questioning. And that identity then projects itself into every interaction, relationship, and outcome you experience. In this way, the origin of external reality is not outside circumstances, but the internal narration that precedes them. Change the dialogue within, and the world that follows begins to shift accordingly. Because perception is obedient to repetition, and repetition becomes reality through sustained attention. When you speak to yourself correctly, you are not describing what is present, but declaring what is becoming within your awareness. This subtle shift in inner language reorients attention away from limitation and toward possibility, allowing new patterns of thought and experience to emerge. Eventually, the external world appears to change. But what has truly changed is the origin point from which you have been speaking inwardly all along. So the origin of external reality is always the unseen conversation you maintain with yourself, continuously shaping what unfolds next. The more awareness you bring to this process, the more intentional your life becomes, because you are finally directing the voice that has always been creating your experience in real time, moment to moment, and beyond, without end. The subconscious mind operates differently from the conscious analytical mind because it does not evaluate truth through logic, debate, or skepticism. Instead, it functions like a recording mechanism that absorbs repeated input and gradually accepts it as identity without questioning the source or validity. When you continuously tell yourself something, whether positive or negative, the subconscious does not pause to verify it against external evidence. It simply begins to treat that repeated message as instruction and organizes thoughts, feelings, and behaviors around it. This is why repetition plays such a crucial role in shaping internal belief, because the subconscious is designed to learn through pattern recognition rather than argument or reasoning. It does not argue against statements like, "I am not good enough" or "nothing ever works for me." It simply begins to generate emotional states and perceptions that align with those declarations. And over time, these internal states influence how you interpret situations and respond to challenges. Even when external reality presents opportunities, the subconscious filter shaped by repeated inner speech can cause you to overlook or dismiss them because they do not match the established internal narrative. In the same way, when a new belief is consistently reinforced, such as "I am capable" or "things are working in my favor," the subconscious begins to adjust perception to align with that assumption. And gradually, you start noticing evidence that supports it without conscious effort. This process is subtle because it bypasses resistance and works beneath awareness, shaping instincts, reactions, and expectations in ways that feel natural and automatic. The subconscious does not require proof. It requires repetition and emotional consistency, which means whatever you emotionally rehearse within yourself becomes more influential than what you intellectually claim to believe on the surface. This is why internal dialogue carries creative power, because it is not just communication, it is conditioning, and every repeated thought becomes part of a deeper programming that eventually expresses itself through choices, habits, and external outcomes, and the boundary between thought and experience begins to dissolve as the inner voice continues to reinforce itself in cycles that quietly direct attention, perception, and response without interruption or contradiction. Self-talk is often misunderstood as casual thinking or harmless mental noise, but in reality it functions as a continuous stream of instruction that the mind uses to organize perception, behavior, and emotional response. It is not separate from creation, because every repeated inner statement carries direction for how you interpret yourself and the world around you. When you say something inwardly, you are not just describing your current state. You are reinforcing a pattern that the mind begins to follow as a guiding principle. Over time, this internal repetition becomes more influential than external reality because the mind prioritizes familiar inner narratives over unfamiliar external evidence. This is why self-talk acts like a hidden script running beneath awareness, shaping reactions before conscious thought even intervenes. When you consistently say things like, "I am stuck" or "things never work for me," you are not just expressing frustration. You are reinforcing a framework through which your mind filters all experiences and begins to notice only confirming evidence. In contrast, when self-talk shifts towards certainty, possibility, and completion, the mind begins to reorganize attention around those new instructions, and gradually perception itself changes. What is important to understand is that self-talk is not neutral. It is directive, and the subconscious treats it as instruction rather than opinion, which means every inner statement carries creative influence, whether intentional or not. Most people underestimate this process because they assume thoughts are passive, but self-talk is active repetition that builds identity and expectation simultaneously. It is through this mechanism that habits of thought become habits of life, because repeated inner language becomes emotional conditioning, and emotional conditioning becomes behavioral impulse, which then shapes outcomes in the external world. The subtle power of self-talk lies in its constant presence. It never stops operating, even when you are unaware of it, and this makes it the most influential force in shaping experience, because it is always reinforcing a particular version of reality within you. And that version becomes the one you naturally express without conscious effort or resistance, as it continues to define how you move through every moment and decision without interruption or reflection. Identity is often assumed to be built from external markers, such as environment, upbringing, achievements, failures, and social feedback, but the deeper mechanism that constructs who you believe you are is the continuous inner speech you maintain about yourself across time. This inner narration acts like an invisible editor that constantly defines what is true about you, what is possible for you, and what category you belong to. When you repeatedly tell yourself certain things, such as, "I am not confident, I am always behind," "I am the type of person who fails," or even the opposite, "I am capable, I learn quickly," "I always find a way," the mind begins to adopt these statements, not as temporary thoughts, but as identity definitions that organize your entire psychological structure. The reason inner speech is more powerful than external circumstances is because circumstances are interpreted through identity, rather than identity being formed by circumstances. Two people can experience the same event, yet describe themselves completely differently afterward because their internal dialogue assigns different meaning to the same situation. One sees failure, another sees learning. One sees rejection, another sees redirection, and that interpretation becomes stored as self-knowledge over time. Identity, therefore, is not a fixed entity, but a continuously reinforced story that is being spoken inwardly without pause, and every repetition strengthens its authority in your subconscious framework. Even when external evidence contradicts it, the inner narrative often remains dominant because the mind trusts familiar self-descriptions more than new information that threatens its established structure. This is why people can achieve success, yet still feel unsuccessful internally or experience progress, yet still identify with lack, because the inner voice has not updated its definition of self. The persistence of identity comes from repetition, not accuracy, and whatever is repeated most consistently becomes the default lens through which all experiences are processed, shaping expectations, reactions, and emotional responses in ways that feel automatic and unquestioned, and this ongoing internal narration continues to assign meaning to every new moment without needing permission from external reality, as it keeps reinforcing the version of self that is being spoken into awareness again and again without interruption or resistance. The moment you change your inner voice, something subtle begins to reorganize within your entire psychological structure, because the inner voice is not just a stream of thoughts, but the command layer that determines how you interpret reality and respond to it. When that voice shifts from limitation to possibility, from doubt to certainty, or from past conditioning to present assumption, the mind is no longer operating under the same instructions it was previously following. This change does not immediately alter external circumstances, but it alters the meaning you assign to those circumstances. And meaning is what ultimately governs perception, behavior, and emotional reaction. As your inner dialogue begins to speak differently, the subconscious starts receiving new repeated signals, and it gradually loosens its attachment to old patterns of expectation. This is not a sudden transformation, but a gradual recalibration of attention where you begin noticing things you previously ignored and interpreting events in ways that align with the new internal narrative. The world itself does not instantly transform, but your experience of it begins to shift first, because perception is always the first layer of reality that changes before physical outcomes follow. What feels like external change is actually internal alignment, expressing itself outwardly through different choices, reactions, and interpretations. When the inner voice consistently affirms a new state of being, the mind begins to adjust emotional responses accordingly, and emotional responses influence behavior without conscious effort. This is why people often experience what feels like a phase of transition, where old reactions no longer feel natural and new reactions begin to emerge gradually. The key shift is that you are no longer reinforcing the previous identity through automatic self-talk, and instead you are feeding a new identity through deliberate, internal speech. Over time, this new voice becomes more dominant than the old one, and as it strengthens, it begins to shape expectations, assumptions, and decisions in a way that naturally aligns with the new direction of life. So the change in inner voice is not symbolic. It is structural because it alters the foundation from which every perception, thought, and action is generated. And once that foundation shifts, the entire experience of life begins to follow without needing force or struggle, as alignment replaces resistance quietly and continuously, shaping what unfolds next. What people commonly label as luck is often not an external force randomly distributing outcomes, but a reflection of the dominant patterns of self-conversation that shape perception, decisions, and interpretation of opportunities. The internal dialogue a person maintains throughout the day creates a mental filter through which experiences are evaluated, and this filter determines what is noticed, acted upon, or ignored. When someone consistently speaks to themselves with expectation, openness, and confidence, their mind becomes more alert to possibilities that align with those assumptions, and they are more likely to take action at the right moment, which then appears as fortunate timing from the outside perspective. In contrast, when someone's inner conversation is dominated by doubt, hesitation, or self-limitation, their attention naturally narrows to problems, risks, and reasons why things will not work, which reduces responsiveness to opportunities that may still be present but are not perceived as accessible or relevant. This difference in perception creates the illusion that one person is lucky while another is not, when in reality both are exposed to similar environments but are interpreting them through different internal narratives. The subconscious mind plays a key role in this process because it constantly aligns perception with repeated self-statements. So if the dominant self-talk reinforces ideas such as "things never work for me" or "opportunities always pass me by," the mind begins to organize attention in ways that confirm those beliefs even without conscious awareness. This leads to missed timing, overlooked signals, and hesitation in moments that require immediate response, which later gets described as bad luck. On the other hand, when the inner conversation consistently affirms readiness, capability, and expectation of positive outcomes, the mind becomes more receptive and responsive, noticing patterns and openings that match those expectations and acting on them with less internal resistance. This creates a chain of experiences that appear externally fortunate but are internally guided by a consistent narrative of possibility rather than restriction. The role of repetition in self-conversation ensures that whichever internal story is most frequently activated becomes the dominant lens shaping decisions and emotional reactions. And over time, this dominant lens influences the probability of outcomes simply by changing what actions are taken and how situations are interpreted in real time as life unfolds through continuous mental framing and selective awareness and habitual expectation patterns operating beneath conscious observation, shaping direction, perception, response, timing, choices, awareness thresholds, attention focus, emotional readiness, behavioral momentum, unfolding silently across daily experience without interruption or reflection. Resistance in life often appears as external obstacles delay confusion or repeated failure. But at a deeper level, it can reflect an internal contradiction in self-talk, where different inner statements are pulling the mind in opposing directions. When a person says they want change but simultaneously maintains inner language that reinforces doubt, fear, or unworthiness, the subconscious receives mixed instructions, and instead of moving forward with clarity, it creates hesitation, uncertainty, and repeated cycles of stalled action. This is because the mind cannot fully commit to a direction when its internal dialogue is divided between expansion and limitation, between possibility and restriction, or between desire and fear. The subconscious organizes behavior based on the most emotionally reinforced and most frequently repeated inner message. So when contradictory self-talk exists, the result is fragmentation of focus and energy, which manifests externally as resistance. In practical terms, this means a person may consciously affirm progress while unconsciously repeating patterns of failure, and the unconscious repetition tends to dominate because it carries emotional weight and habitual strength. This creates a loop where effort is made in one direction, but internal expectation pulls in another, resulting in experiences that feel blocked, inconsistent, or frustrating without a clear external cause. Life begins to feel like it is pushing back, but what is actually happening is a lack of internal agreement that prevents coherent action and sustained momentum from forming. The mind seeks consistency, and when it does not find it in inner speech, it expresses that inconsistency through external instability, where decisions feel heavy, motivation fluctuates, and outcomes do not align with intention. The resolution of resistance, therefore, does not come from forcing external conditions to change, but from unifying internal dialogue so that self-talk consistently supports a single direction without contradiction. When inner speech becomes aligned, focused, and repetitive in one clear narrative, the subconscious no longer has to split attention between opposing beliefs and begins to organize perception and behavior more efficiently, leading to smoother decisions, clearer focus, and more direct movement toward desired outcomes. As internal coherence replaces fragmentation and mental conflict, dissolves into steady directional flow that shapes experience from within continuously without interruption or reversal. Speaking to yourself correctly as if your desire is already fulfilled is not about denying current circumstances, but about shifting the level from which you are operating internally. It means that instead of describing what is missing or uncertain, you begin to assume the feeling identity and inner certainty of the end result, as though it is already established within your awareness. This inner adjustment does not require physical evidence because it is not based on external validation, but on internal assumption, which is the creative starting point of all experience. When the mind is repeatedly exposed to statements that reflect completion, such as, "I already am that version," or "it is already done," it begins to reorganize attention away from lack and toward confirmation of that assumed state. This does not immediately alter the physical world, but it alters the psychological framework through which the world is interpreted and responded to, and that shift is the beginning of visible change. The subconscious mind responds not to what is logically true in the present moment, but to what is emotionally accepted as real through repetition and inner conviction. So when you consistently speak from the standpoint of fulfillment, you are training perception to align with that state rather than with current conditions. Over time, this creates a natural change in behavior, expectations, and emotional responses because the inner assumption begins to feel more dominant than external contradiction, and when inner certainty becomes stronger than outer doubt, actions begin to reflect that certainty without force or struggle. Speaking from fulfillment also changes the relationship between desire and distance, because instead of chasing something outside yourself, you begin to inhabit it internally, which reduces resistance and emotional separation from the outcome. This internal alignment creates a sense of calm expectation rather than anxious pursuit, and that state influences decisions, timing, and perception in subtle ways that gradually reshape experience. The key is consistency, because the mind does not change through occasional affirmation, but through sustained inner repetition that replaces old identity-based speech with new identity-based assumption. And as this new internal language stabilizes, it becomes the foundation from which thoughts, feelings, and actions naturally emerge, allowing external reality to reorganize itself around the inner declaration that has been repeatedly accepted as true within consciousness itself, continuously shaping direction without visible effort or conscious strain.